Alright, I'm going to be going over some of the answers from this test review. I'm not going to write every single answer, but I'll at least verbally go over them. So, symbiosis, it's just two different species that are interacting in some way in their ecosystem. Doesn't have to be good for both of them necessarily. The competitive exclusion principle says that no two species can occupy the same niche. So if they're trying to live in the same place and use the same resources and just fill the same role in the ecosystem at the same time, that can't really happen. So what'll happen is there'll be competition between the two species that are trying to fill the same niche. One of them will eventually win and then sort of overpower the other species. Then these three are all the types of symbiosis. Mutualism is when they both help each other. Commensalism is when one of them gets a benefit, the other doesn't really care. And parasitism is when one of them gets a benefit and the other is harmed by the relationship. Invasive species are species that are not native to an ecosystem, so they come from somewhere else. And in order to be considered invasive, they also have to, be very successful in the ecosystem. So they multiply, they take over, and they take over niches that other native species were occupying. So they outcompete the native species for their resources, for their homes, etc. And that's why they can be so damaging to the ecosystem, because they can wipe out the native species, which are, a crucial part of the food chain and the food web within the native ecosystem. There are lots of invasive species in Oregon. Some of them that you see the most often include the Himalayan blackberry and also the English ivy as far as plants, but there's also, the bullfrogs, the red-eared slider turtle. There's lampreys, there's a lot of other plants like morning glory and holly and some different kinds of grasses. There's just really a lot of invasive species in Oregon. Okay, for these examples, I think you can refer to the slides or the presentation that you gave with the slides. And so now the next standard about populations. So a population is a group of the same species living in the same place, basically. So all one species living in one particular location, sort of contiguously. Carrying capacity is the maximum number of a certain organism that an ecosystem can support. So there's kind of a limit to how many of any given species can live in a certain area before there's just not enough resources, there's not enough food or water or space or whatever for them to be able to live there. And that's going to be different for every ecosystem and every different organism. But every ecosystem and organism does have some carrying capacity. So what determines those carrying capacities are limiting factors. So they are, factors that limit how big a population can get. They prevent it from just going bigger and bigger and bigger forever. Density-dependent limiting factors means that as the population gets more dense, they become more of a factor. And so those include things like competition for food, for resources, for water, also spread of disease and parasites. The more closely packed the individuals are, the more likely things are to spread amongst them. That also includes stress due to overcrowding. They're crowded so close together, it can cause stress on them. And then density-independent limiting factors are things that it doesn't really matter how big or how condensed the population is, they'll still affect them. And those are things like natural disasters and also, man-made disasters. Biodiversity is just really how diverse a certain ecosystem is. So how many different species are there living in this ecosystem? Some ecosystems have lots of different species, some have not very many different species. Extinct is when a species basically is no longer alive in the wild. There aren't any of them there. And endangered is kind of one level down from extinct. It's possible that they could become extinct soon because their populations are declining, but there's still some of them out there. There are a lot of reasons biodiversity is important, and you can refer to those slides about biodiversity for that. Now, the growth curve. So exponential growth curve, if this is time, I'm not going to maybe fully label these, and this is the population size, so how big the population is. An exponential growth curve is shaped kind of like a J, where it sort of starts off slower, but then it skyrockets until eventually it's almost a vertical line going up. And this is how populations will grow if they had as much resources and space and food and whatever as they wanted. If they had an infinite amount of all of the things they need to survive, populations will always grow exponentially. However, since we live in the real world and there's not an infinite, unlimited supply of resources, instead, populations tend to grow logistically, where at first, when a population is introduced to an area, it takes off really fast, but then it kind of levels off. And it might bob around a little bit, but it levels off at some stable level. And then that level that it evens out at would be the carrying capacity. And this is because eventually the population growth is going to start to slow down because, again, competition for resources, all those density-dependent limiting factors, cause the population not to just be able to grow exponentially forever. So factors that limit the size of a population, we kind of talked about those back in the density-dependent and independent factors, so you can look at that. And then this question 6 is dealing with succession. So remember, succession can be primary or secondary. Primary succession is when everything in the ecosystem is completely destroyed. Secondary succession is when the ecosystem is sort of damaged, but not everything is destroyed. So I would say that a volcano erupts and destroys the ecosystem, like what we saw in the Mount St. Helens video, where, it was just mowed down with lava and pyroclastic flows and whatnot, and everything was just gray, featureless, looked like the moon. We would call that a type of primary succession. And so what's going to happen is, gradually life's going to start to come back. And the first species that recolonize this destroyed area are the pioneer species. In the case of Mount St. Helens, that was the lupin and the gophers. And gradually, as those species sort of help improve the situation in the environment, other species begin to be able to come in. And over time, and it could be a lot of time, the ecosystem eventually can return to its climax community, where it's back to the fully recovered ecosystem with all the species that it was, before the disaster occurred. Right. If you have any other questions, be sure to send them to me.